Webcam microphone up close. Webcam microphone up close.
At the age of 19 in 1962, she was a...
See, but I have the files. You know, I read the stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things. I said to myself, how can that be possible? The brain, you know, pistols and the fondle slab of choice, I don't know, computers doesn't really matter. Internet, professional wrestlers, and not Jesse Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the cartoon comes from as long as it's real. It doesn't, it's hard to get real information. Because seriously, they don't want you to have just these two sources whenever I try to prove out one of these things. It's not as you expect your government to tell you the truth, you're going to sadly disappoint another one of these things.
Dear Lord, what a dirty, dirty old man.
Really can't be serious. Is this really how you want things to be? Come on. More hooker, eruptions, whatever.
Like Dave Powers kind of.
Really?
Allegedly broadcast live from Pima Region 2. Within the borders of the formerly united and currently occupied states of America, we bring you the Ochelli Effect.
It's like, damn sure, no, I'm an original.
We have all these situations. I'd love to know why it takes 50 years, for...
That's that.
And that is that. It is Saturday night, and all that noise, you know what that means? It's time for the Ochelli Effect on UCY.TV. Okay, tonight, little something different. Normally I do the live show, and I'm live right now. But, with the assistance of a couple of my friends, Mr. Jim Funk helped me out on the recording end of this. JJ, our friend over there, you know him, Against the Wall Man. You know who I'm talking about. I'm sure most of you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Is going to assist me here also, because tonight we're going to bring you something real special. We all know about November 22nd, 1963. We all know about November 24th, 1963. The day President Kennedy was assassinated on the 22nd. On the 24th, they killed the accused assassin right there in public again, this time on television. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald. We know him. What we also know is that at one point he defected to the U.S.S.R. Well, I got an interview, and I'm the only guy who's ever gotten one on the radio with this man, Mr. Ernst Titovets. Tonight, I'm going to play what I pre-recorded yesterday, but I'm not going to give you the whole thing because I don't have time for it all. Before you get that interview, we're going to play a little something which is rare audio of Oswald and Titovets when they were young, because obviously Oswald didn't get to live very long anyway. He was 24 years old when he died. Titovets was a medical student at that time in the Soviet Union, in Belarus specifically, in a town called Minsk. Okay? And these two guys, just young guys, had a tape recorder, and Titovets was recording him to try and study his English, his mannerisms, the way he spoke, because Titovets was very interested in the English language. So, two young guys screwing around with a tape recorder, they read stuff, they play acted, they act like they did radio shows, and there's a couple of minutes here at the beginning, which is not my recording, it's Dr. Titovets' recording, of the two of them screwing around with the tape recorder, which was later used out of context, as you'll hear explained in my discussion with Dr. Titovets, to sort of vilify Oswald even further. Now, Titovets has written a book. It's of interest. It's called Russian Episode, which I only found out recently is available in this country finally. It was the kind of book that I used to have to dig up from strange sources, okay? Not widely published. But now Amazon has it on Kindle if you're really interested in the story from somebody who actually knew the man. That's the bottom line. This is somebody who knew the man. So again, a big thank you to Jim Funky again for helping me with this recording, because that was a big help. And also, my man JJ, please, when you're ready, JJ, go ahead and roll it, and I hope you guys enjoy this. Thanks.
My story being done, she gave me for my pains a world of sighs. She swore in faith 'twas strange, 'twas passing strange, 'twas pitiful, was wondrous pitiful. She wished she had not heard it, yet she wished that heaven had made her such a man. She thanked me and bade me, if I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story, and that would woo her. Upon this hint I spake. She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did not pity them. This only is the witchcraft I have used. Here comes the lady. Let her witness it.
Obviously from...
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we are bringing you direct from the Capitol in Washington, D.C., a talk with the state senator of Texas, Senator Titovets. Senator Titovets, will you give your opinion on the Berlin crisis and the crisis in Texas about the weather? Now I'll try to draw the connection between the Berlin crisis and the weather conditions in Texas. I think it's a very important question. So it's rather what? You have a English accent, and it's difficult to answer this question straight. But nevertheless, some connection does exist, and thank you, Senator Titovets, for a very clear and objective answer to these questions. I'm sure all of the radio listeners understand the problem now. Will you give your opinion on the President's new farm program? Well, I'll try to. President's new farm program consists of several parts which include the most important article which I'm sure influence our economy and bring common happiness. Thank you, Senator Titovets. All your answers to these questions were clear and well thought out. Ladies and gentlemen, now I broadcast here from the courtyard. Well, the man shouting is a famous killer. Well,
here's the piece that's out of context.
He killed his grandma, and he hanged his mother. And now I give the word to Mr. Jack Marr. Sir? Here you have his voice.
Goddamn,
well,
Mr. Machine gun, I'll shoot up everybody in the goddamn place.
Will you tell us about your last killing?
Well, it was a young girl under a bridge. She came in carrying a loaf of bread, and I just cut her throat from ear to ear.
What for?
Well, I wanted the loaf of bread, of course.
And what do you think to be your most famous killing in your life?
Well, the time I killed 8 men on the Bowery sidewalk there, they were just standing there loafing around. I didn't like their faces, so I just shot them all with a machine gun. It was very, very famous. All the newspapers carried the story.
Thank you very much. And whom do you prefer kill?
Well, it's all the same to me. I don't know. They're going to execute me tomorrow anyway. So.
Well, you know, he's a very famous killer. He will deserve his electric chair.
Yeah. Well, they're coming to get me now. I have to go. So long. Here we are on the death cell. Well, they're strapping him in. They're putting him on the chair now.
The officer is approaching the stand. He's raising his arm. He's taking the
switch.
The switch. Now?
For the last word.
Well, what is your last word?
Well, don't pull the switch!
Just a little more.
Ladies and gentlemen, now I'll present to you a famous professor. His name is Mr. Pepper. He's going to give his interview on agriculture. Here we have several questions by our readers. The first question is, what do you think about harvest of grain this year?
Well, I think the grain harvesting this year will be particularly good in so much as the people have been following my advice about burying black cats on each acre. Black cat is definitely necessary in order for a good harvest.
Thank you very much. Well, question from Mrs. Whisker, Texas. She's asking us how to raise peppers. What do you think about this, Professor?
Well, I don't know why anybody from Texas would want to raise peppers in the first place. But if it's absolutely necessary, then you can plant the seeds in a pot of coal dust and sulfuric acid and wait and see what happens.
Thank you very much for this clear explanation, Professor. So, question from Mr. Tommy Gun. He's asking about influence rain upon potatoes.
Well, it's a very widespread conception that rain has some sort of influence on the growth of potatoes. That's completely wrong. You should shelter your potatoes from rain as much as possible so that none of it gets on the potatoes. It causes green spots.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor, Mr. Ankel, she's asking how to raise cabbage on apple tree.
Well, that is a problem with which I've been working for the last 25 years. And although I've managed to grow watermelons on a tree, I've never been able to grow cabbages yet.
Well, thank you, Professor. And the last question is from Miss Jones. She's asking us about her beads. Well, and what size they can grow.
Well, I have grown 4-pound and 3-pound beets in my laboratory. From there, for the benefit of Mrs. Jones, I'd like to say that I think this interview is stupid.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you for your kind attention. We're very glad to have been with you today. I want you to write in and tell us about your suggestions. If you have some advice about the program, you just send your letters right in care of box 707, Shanghai, China. If you're a New York correspondent, Oswald, and the Moscow correspondent, Titovets.
You're gone. Go ahead.
Okay, there's going to be a brief pause here. And then,
not a problem, Jim.
I can set up this other clip.
Not a problem. The other one is really long, and the deal is that this is the unedited interview. I've only chopped off part of the beginning to try and make it a little easier to listen to, because there's a little bit of warming up to a person when you're talking to them and stuff like that during these types of interviews. I've conducted these hundreds of times. I mean, Titovets is probably the 30th guy or so that I've spoken to from the Soviet Union who was there at the time Oswald had defected. Now, that first clip, I just want to stress again, was is over 50 years old, so the quality's a little rough. It's an old style, reel-to-reel kind of tape, and it sounds a little rough. But the thing is, I wanted to give you guys sort of a little bit of a sneak kind of peek into what the guy sounded like back then. Titovets has hours of this stuff where these guys were just, like I said, screwing around. And that's all it was. It was jokes. It was, let's read from a book. Let's make up a news story. This is the kind of thing, like I said, people like myself and a lot of other people in my generation, I'm sure, had played around with tape recorders when we were kids. It was one of those things we did. So this was sort of like a little glimpse into that. And this is the type of audio that doesn't make the rounds. Normally, the only stuff you get to hear Oswald speak on is either when he's begging for a lawyer and claiming he's a patsy, or if you dig a little deeper, you get the stuff from him supporting the Fair Play for Cuba committee on radio in New Orleans. Okay, so that's the way that was. Now we're going to go into the interview, which I conducted just yesterday with Dr. Titovets.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right.
Say when.
Yep. Whenever you're ready to roll, bro.
Okay, rolling.
That was portrayed in the official explanation given in our United States government records by...
Okay.
It's an unfortunate thing because Lee Harvey Oswald first of all, is not the monster that was portrayed in the official explanation given in our United States government records by historians who were charged with the task of writing the official history regarding the assassination of President Kennedy. And in addition to that, later on, various what I will gently call creative writing exercises have occurred regarding this young man. First of all, let us put it in perspective. Lee Harvey Oswald was dead at the age of 24. So this was a very young man. Mm-hmm. And to understand why it is that that your portrait of him is so valuable is because I believe the last time you saw him was in 1962 or 1.
Yeah, May 1962 we parted before he went with his family to Moscow on his way to the United States. Yes, that's correct.
Right. So in 1962 was the last time you saw him. But only a year and a half later, he was dead. And again, that's at the age of 24.
And Charles, one more thing. We corresponded through letters till October. Actually, my last letter to him dated October, were about that. I asked him for a few research books. I was in my postgraduate course at that time. And he, before that, he said he would be coming over and he might give me the books by hand. He was planning to go back to the Soviet Union. I just want to stress here that our friendship continued to the very last days almost.
Right. And what I was also extremely impressed by was these little bits of audio, which have seen some light on the internet, but have not been widely distributed, where the two of you were, again, as very young men, sort of doing what a lot of young men do when they have tape recorders and recording equipment, at least that's the way it was prior to the electronic age. We would utilize these things and sort of play with them. And I found it very almost heartwarming to hear the more human side of this man, because this was just a young man sort of having a good time with a tape recorder with you.
Oh, exactly. There's a lot of fun there to sit in front of a recording machine. Yeah.
And, you guys were doing these, just to give a brief sort of description, you sort of, pretended to, make radio shows with, this is the only piece of it I've heard. My understanding is you have hours of recordings. And, unfortunately,
Chuck, we started with my idea was to study, his English. I wasn't exactly happy of him being American. My English, was British English, British background. But still, I want to study his English, and I suggested a recording session. Actually, there were 2 recording sessions. And it started with first reading material, and gradually it degenerated into that sort of fun, 2 young, boys sitting in front of tape recorder. It's sort of, you can't keep serious all the time. And it came to those mock interviews and all that sort of things. He would ask me to perform some combat things, and he would command, ask me going through this military, right face, left face, about face, all that of things, That is fun. Yeah. And again, looking back, it's material that wasn't, shall I put it, prejudiced. It wasn't, it's just very spontaneous, and that's the importance of all that. I'm just listening to all those recordings. I sort of experience kind of nostalgia of those times. Yeah?
Right. And it was also something that you noted introducing those clips that you have allowed to come out a little bit. When you were discussing it, you had discussed the misuse of one of the clips by a documentary filmmaker, which I went and found the documentary so that I could understand precisely what you were saying. And it was misused to, again, portray this young man in an evil light, when meanwhile he was simply play acting.
Exactly, you know, it's a very dirty trick. Excuse me, are you aware I was an invited key speaker at the 50th anniversary JFK assassination at Dallas? I actually, during my first lecture there, I let the audience hear the whole of that tap, not the curtailed one, and I explained the context. You know, it's very important to know what context those recordings were done in. And yes, you know, I am not surprised at people demonizing Lee and using this, well, this is the approach, this character, assassin character was created by using unclean approaches, you know. But somehow I'm not surprised at that. I've seen so, well, a lot of wrong things about him. Well, yeah.
Yes, the distortion of Lee Harvey Oswald as a person, the portrait which has been painted for the public, is quite different from what the real guy was. And to demonize him is convenient for those who wish to convict him in the public's mind. Because remember, he was never convicted of the crimes for which he is often just simply attributed to. In other words, he is often already presumed guilty in the literature that is in support of the official line here. They might occasionally add the word accused assassin, but the truth is that he is always mentioned as an assassin, as a murderer, as a multiple murderer, and the idea that there was something else besides these sort of clues, which are then grown into much larger ideas about him, about, well, at that time supporting the idea of the Red Scare that was still prominent in this country, the sort of demonizing of him as
if I may just comment on this. He says, I'm just citing from a book. He writes, I believe that pertains to that period of Cold War, of that, and he writes, I believe under both systems, I sought the answer, and although, I sought the answers, and although it would be easy to dupe myself into believing one system is better than the other, I know it's not. And another thing, he writes, we have, well, it's his credo, we have no interest in violently opposing the U.S. government. Why should we manifest opposition when there are far greater forces at work to bring about the fall of the United States government that we could possibly master? Well, he thought about aftermath of the atomic war and everything. It was, at that time, it was a critical period, and there was Caribbean crisis, and again, assassination of President Kennedy. There's moments that could be easily the result of which could have been war. And another thing, what is needed is a constructive and practical group of persons desiring peace, but steadfastly opposed to the revival of forces that have led millions of people to death and destruction in the dozen wars. Well, in the first and foremost, in nature, he was a very peaceful person as far as his character was concerned. The examples of his confrontation with a guy at work at factory who was ready to fight, also just look at him quietly, and that quiet that guy down. And again, during his confrontation in New Orleans with what's his name?
Carlos Berenguer.
Yeah. Again, he looked at him, and that somehow quietened people down, his opponent. And there are many. And again, this is part of his character, non-violence. And again, his attitude to kids. He was very fond of his own kids. He would give well in advance the names of his girls. Well, a boy, a girl, he didn't know at the time. Well, so my impression was, when you're in touch with, when you know a person for quite a time, you feel how he feels, how his attitude. I never felt myself uncomfortable with him. It was a sort of, psychological compatibility between the two of us. And it was quite okay, although sometimes the situation when I would have been somewhere, wished I would have been somewhere else. He had his moods, certainly. But I'm very grateful to him before he left. At that time, Komsomolets, that's me, having a friend, an American for a friend, was sort of suspicious. Everybody knew that I was a little bit freakish in the sense that I went in for English and progressed. And that was the explanation. And actually it was the point of attraction between me and Lee. But again, he realized in what kind of society he lived. Soviet Russia at that time. And in his diary, he wrote that I'm not telling, it's a free quotation, I'm not telling my friend Ernst that Eric, in Russia, Eric is friendly for Ernst, not Ernie, it's Russian way.
Right.
Telling that guy going to back home, he's too good young Communist League member. That was absolute. At first, when I read it first, I was surprised. What the hell he meant? I was just ringing by a Communist young Communist League member. As all around me, it was routine. And suddenly, in his eyes, I became too good a young Communist League member. Only then I realized that he extended me his protection. That was his sort of how he viewed me. I was okay from point of view of Soviet whoever wanted to know my how I felt towards Russian ways, social society and everything. It was a friendly turn. And another thing, I believe he actually saved my life. I paid no attention to this. It was an accident. We were on our way to Institute of Foreign Languages to see girls, to speak English mostly. Well, and we were crossing the street. It was dark already. I was thinking about my things, and suddenly we were somewhere in the middle of the street. And suddenly he pushed me back, and next a bush of a car, and they were sitting in the real lights of a car speeding. At that time, we didn't have many cars. There weren't many cars in Minsk, actually, just a few. And this only car, Oswald gasped, has almost got us. I didn't pay my attention to that, much heed to that. But he was really shocked at that time. And thinking back, analyzing the situation, I rather suspect that it wasn't that innocent situation, because the car, a speeding car shouldn't approach the axle line. It should have kept to the right side of the road, and it's absolutely empty. Well, so that's, you know how I feel about him.
Right. In other words, your observation at that time is, and just to clarify, you sort of weren't paying attention and had no reason to, because it's at night. There aren't many vehicles on the road anyway. You're walking, and very suddenly you were startled by the fact that he shoved you backwards and kept you away from this car which sped by you. And you think this is quite indicative of his personality. This is the type of person that that you knew.
Self-explanatory, self-explanatory. He might have jumped alone, but he did it instinctively. There was no time to think about situation. He had to act. I was looking another way. I didn't see the approaching car. He saw it. And it was absolutely instinctive, is what he did.
That's really telling. That's really telling.
That's telling. And other small things, he was really, people ask why he came to the Soviet Union. What the hell? Why? And somehow in literature, people don't pay, those who write about him, they somehow overlook simple thing, his social-political ambition. He actually came to the Soviet Union to study the system. He explicitly writes about that in his, whatever he wrote. And he got disappointed with the system. And still, he was very patriotic about the United States. Whenever we would argue about, say, starting with system, army, or girls, he would be on the American side. He would insist that, American girls were better. They were, take care about his, her husband. At that time, they were a little bit, idealistic about the family. And when it came to comparing who army is best, he would insist that American army was best. Marines were best. Even about pace, this movement was best. Here we had an argument. The thing is that this movement is different in the Soviet Army and in the United States. And we discussed that point. It was just made it quite an issue about that. Behind that stood whose army is best. And I insisted that our army is best. I never was very fond of, I never viewed myself as serving in the army, although after completing, graduating from the medical institute, I was promoted to junior lieutenant in medicine. And I never considered myself connected somehow with my future with the army. And here I became an ardent defender of army values, and Lee, on the other hand, became ardent defender of his values. And again, when it came to comparing the systems, it was a tete-a-tete talk. We started coming from slavery up to the Soviet, present systems. At that time, I knew nothing about capitalism. The iron curtain was very effective in concealing the true things about capitalism, and I insisted that the Soviet system was all around good. And, well, I put it to him that in the United States, black people were lynched. He said, I'm sorry about that. Yes, unfortunately it happened. But when I pressed my point that we are here overall perfect, he exploded and said, you live here like slaves. You don't know about other world. You are influenced with your breeding. That was a telling thing. You know, the very moment that we discuss these points with him, comparing the system, was telling. It was his initiative. I would have never raised this point with my own kind, with students, everything, as boring. We knew all those indoctrinations. It was absolutely boring, yes. And anybody who would go in for, say, political work, say, in Komsomol, looking forward to becoming a member of Communist Party and getting, just rising in career, I would shun away. I would find those people absolutely, dull and interesting, and wouldn't discuss these points with them. But with me, I just saw his attitude. He was really interested in that. And surprising that this point is all missing from serious literature. I believe it's only one book, I don't remember the title of the book, that raises this point. And this explains everything. When he came to Soviet Russia, he came over to study the system. He got disappointed, and still he created his Athenian system, the one that should be, if anything, could be used for the United States.
Well, what he did, from what I understand, is that when he went there and studied the what was the communist Soviet system from the inside at that point, and he had also lived under the American system, he still retained his basic patriotism for the United States, because that was simply his home.
Absolutely.
And that is a missed point all the time with Oswald, because they often try to paint him as someone who hated the country, who hated the president, and this is simply not true. The other problem is that when he did this and looked at both systems, he became sort of disappointed with each of the flaws in those systems, and in his own mind started to create what he thought, as many of us do, what would be the best solution for the difference between these two places. In other words, in a perfect world, what would I like to see from the best of these two types of differing systems, which I have now lived under? I mean, right. And that is what I have understood about him. And I've had to piece it together over years. And here's the thing. When I first discovered your book, okay, I'm going to be honest with you, I thought, oh no, here we go again. Because many times there have been articles and parts of books that have been released by individuals who claim to have knowledge of the man, okay, and their portraits never include any of this real, actual sort of intimate information about the way the man thought, about the way the man saw the world. And this is a very telling problem with that literature. This is why your book became such a great interest to me, because I could tell by the types of details that were there that this was not a propaganda piece. This was not a piece of guesswork. I know that some of the detail in your book you found through research, but it's mainly as a matter of background information.
So, if I may just make a comment here, After the collapse of the Soviet Union, under communism wouldn't dare to say a word about we were brainwashed and warned to the effect he never existed. Forget about that. Go on with your work. Well, I went on with my research. It was very time-consuming and everything. And to me, it was just a history. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Americans started visiting Minsk, I interpreted for them, and suddenly I discovered that interest, undying interest to Lee Harvey Oswald, JFK, and they encouraged me to give my side of the story. And I thought, why not? I had to get it out of my system. And that how I started on this book. And it was absolutely personal. And that time I had no information. Well, we had no internet at that time. I knew nothing about what went on about JFK issue in the United States, about all those contradictions, all those, things. I was concentrated on my own experience and on the man itself. I had to get it out of my system, and which I did eventually. Well, certainly there was interviews, and I discovered a lot more about I discovered that he was misunderstood by the Russians at work and everything. They viewed him like a performing seal, and it irritated him. He understood that he did not belong. No matter how he tried to assimilate himself to his new socialist environment. Possibly that was why he eventually decided to go back home when he really belonged, but with new experience, and being young. Although at that time he wasn't that young to be too idealistic. He was very serious about building this, in theory, this new society, which he described in the outline of which he gave him his Athenian system. And surprisingly, there he writes about forbidding firearms, those many things that are urgent today. And again, people somehow don't view him as a serious thinker. During I remember one other discussion on the philosophical points on idealism and materialism. We at the Medical Institute, we had a course on political philosophy, and as an example of devious teaching, we studied Hume, Hegel, and all the other philosophers. And in a confinement in my room, after a hearty meal that our mother prepared for us, we were alone, and somehow we drifted on, became philosophical minded, And I started discussing, I think, points of sense perception. Do we really know about the outer world? And I started academically, approach this issue academically, and so I realized that he wasn't academically educated to grasp the point. And when I came down to simple things, like saying, well, listen, Lee, there is a chair here, it's solid, it has color, it has weight. Do we believe it's a real thing? We are being perceive all that through our senses. How can we be sure that it's the real thing? And he immediately grasped the idea, and he gave quite reasonable. The conversation became quite mutually rewarding,
So the complexity of his ability to think in the abstract was profound.
Yeah.
Yes.
And one point here, we we arrive to conclusion there is no difference between matter and and God, who is behind all that. And the funny thing is, he said, God is. I'm not sure about I never really spoke about his beliefs, but that was his conclusion, God is. Although I'm atheist myself. Well, and another thing about his, whether, if one carefully listens to what he gave in his radio debates, about Fair Play for Cuba Committee, he is quite an interesting orator. For example, I'll just give you this. He would say, it's the debate, with Bill Sticker, what's his name, Stuckey.
Yeah, Bill Stuckey. These were the WDSU interviews, which I'm very familiar with.
Well, now listen to his oratory. He says, we are not interested in what Cuban exiles or rioters have to say. We are interested in the attitude of the United States government. And listen, how about Kennedy? Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. I hope it's not far-fetched. He uses contrast, but he was uneducated. It came natural to him. And there were other things about his oratory to go on there. I don't just... anyway.
I would like to actually address part of that, because this has been a very serious point of contention among JFK researchers especially, and I want to get your impression about his abilities linguistically and all of that. I understand that what you're saying here is that his ability to be very precise in his language.
To the point, yes.
Right. But here is the thing. What we're talking about, though, is a young man who is born in this country and his native language is English. What was your impression of his command of the Russian language?
Well, he gradually grew more fluent with his Russian. He understood a lot. He spoke Russian with Russian accent. I'll give an example. If you are a Russian, you will hear something like, I can speak Russian very well. I read Russian newspapers, something like that. That's his accent. And I'm surprised that nobody corrected his phonetics. Otherwise, he was quite competent and understood perfectly well what he was told to. Possibly as when he was told joke, he would miss a punchline. Well, that's only reasonable, I would say. But gradually he improved his Russian and was quite fluent.
And that is his spoken command of the language. But did you have any occasion to take note of his ability to write in Russian? Because the languages are extremely different. The alphabets are extremely different. And this is a linguistic task, which is not, your English is very, very, solid. Okay. It's excellent. Compared to others whom I have talked to over the years who were native to any of the let's call them the Soviet countries, any of them. Your English is extremely good, but this has been acquired over many years for you. But however, even when you were a young man, your English was very solid. But not an easy task for an English speaker to learn to write in Russian. Do you know anything about his ability to write in Russian?
Yeah. I have an artifact, a book, where on last page he writes in Russian. he is considering names for his future kid. Marina was in the family way at that time. At that time, they had this Doppler. Actually, well, they couldn't see what gender of the kid would be, and he contemplated names for a boy and a girl, and he writes that in Russian. And all that is signed by both, by Marina and by him. They came to June if it is a girl, and David if it is a boy. He gave me some reason why he did that. I don't remember. But he wrote it in Russian. In rather sort of, his writings were a little bit mixture of, well, anyway, he wrote in Russian, a rather clear way, but he did it in Russian, yes.
Well, I've been told in the past that some of the examples which have been presented, because I've had them interpreted for me by native Russian speakers and also by those who were taught Russian as a second language, to compare and contrast the interpretations of how proper his writing was. I was told that his writing style was actually much more of the proper variety than the average Russian would have normally written. Even is that true?
I wouldn't say that. No, I wouldn't say that. No.
Okay. Well, that's great, because I have always found that to be rather suspicious, that I was being told that.
And one more thing, they say he was dyslexic, and when you read his diary, it sort of sort of supports this idea. But I have his writing. I would ask to write for me words of from Showboat, those sang by Paul Robson, Old Man River, then Prayer, and he wrote it in his longhand. Nothing dyslexic about that. It was absolutely perfect. So it's surprising. I think, just thinking about that, I think he consults local psychiatrists. Is it possible to be sort of in one situation perfect writer? I mean, demonstrate perfect writing, and another situation just dyslexic sort of writing. Well, yes.
Okay. A few other things that I want to make sure that we cover, because and I know that this may bother you a little bit. I apologize if it does, but I know that there have been other portraits out there of him, and I want to address a couple of them specifically, because I feel as though they do not contain the amount of honesty that yours does. Okay? Which again, Dr. Titovets' book is the Oswald Russian episode, and if you find it, get it, because it is an absolute must among JFK literature.
Excuse me. It is on the Amazon on sale on the e-copy. It's available now. It's on Amazon Kindle. It's already available.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that, because at the time.
So look it up, and it is available.
Great, because at the time I acquired it, it was very difficult to get.
Yeah. Well, I brought with me the rest of 160 copies to the United States when I was in Dallas, and they all were found by owners in a couple of days. People were delighted to have that. They would ask me to sign those books, even to sign the front shirts. I was sort of the local star at that time. Although in Dallas, there wasn't the representatives of mainstream media, but still, I was interviewed, and I like about the attitude. During on the 24th, Lee Harvey Oswald was killed. Now, there was a session, and the presiding man asked the audience, suggested a minute silence in the memory of Lee. That's the attitude, was there. And so people there don't believe he was guilty in what he was officially accused of. He wasn't capable of all that,
Well, I believe that exactly sums up my position on Mr. Oswald. I've spent a great deal of time attempting to discover the truth about his participation in the events that day. I know that the truth is not fully known for certain, but I also don't believe, based on the character of the man that I have gotten to know by discussing him with individuals who had direct contact with him, that in all likelihood he would not have been capable of even half of what it is that they have ascribed to him. So honestly, this is also my attitude, that this was in general an innocent man. If anything, he may have been manipulated in some way by individuals. And this is another point about his trip into the Soviet Union at that time that I'd like to get to, and that is that many people feel that he was utilized because of his military background as what was a false defector program at the time, which we do now know existed in the United States to sort of put individuals into the Soviet Union as defectors to gather information from behind the Iron Curtain at the time. Do you have an opinion about this, sir?
There are many, I believe there are many programs spying on each other country, respective countries was just the routine things. As for Lee, he came, when he lived in Minsk, he was in complete isolation. And he was given, things that could be considered classified. And got a glimpse of those things. For one, at the factory where they made also equipment for the military, radar installation and everything.
Right, that was the Russian.
And Dr. Titovets, one second. You're talking about his time in what they always refer to as the radio factory in Minsk, where he was given a job and paid a reasonably better salary than the average worker.
Exactly, yeah. But at the same time, he knew about that production in the first place. Then he lived near the original military quarters, and he could observe the movement of the cars, the military insignia, what ranks people were coming there, the activity, the rise and fall of activities, all that might be the military intelligence. Then Professor Cherkasova, whom he got acquainted with, he went in for a classified research on low doses of radiation effect, low doses radiation on animals. Also, that was a classified research. He was not interested. And during his reside in the Soviet Union, he became an absolutely useless spy. He had no means of communicating with whoever would have sent him to there. And besides, I wouldn't concentrate on Oswald. Embassy staff in the United States, in the Soviet Union, they knew perfectly well what situation was in the Soviet Union at that time. Other embassies, like British Embassy and all other embassies, they had full information. And then I see what impact this one man could have produced on military, intelligent thinking. What kind of information, useful information, he could have brought home. No way, absolutely. Certainly there are now trends to connect Lee with intelligence. Well, as far as I know from the literature, he was connected. He was admitted. He got his. He was radar operator at Sugi Airport, and he had to obtain his clearance at that time, and that means that he was debriefed by, somebody belonging to intelligence community.
Right. He actually had a crypto clearance in the military and was part of the U.S.S.R spy program, which was based at that time. He was at one of the main bases, which was in Atsugi in Japan, which was one of the main military/CIA bases in that region of the world. But here's the other interesting and very telling incident, and I wonder if you'd like to comment about this, because at the time that Lee was in the Soviet Union, the Francis Gary Powers, the downing of the U-2 plane, which has become a point of discussion in the United States regarding Oswald and all of that. It is my impression that Oswald knew nothing about this until it was sort of announced among the Soviet public at the time, as any other news story would have been typically at that time. And he was working at this radio factory that we're talking about, that is all the time mentioned. It was a radio factory, it was a television factory, all these different things. But the point here, I wonder if you could give us a little bit of an insight about how he learned about that, how he felt about that, because you were right there with him at the time, weren't you?
We never discussed this point with him, with Lee. But his girlfriend, Eva German, reminisced that he was very worried about that incident. Somehow his worry was that he might be somehow connected with putting down that U-2 plane, although he didn't specify what exactly his worries were. He got the idea that people might be nasty to him because he was American. At that time, there was an outcry, public outcry, how dare you spy over the Soviet Union. That was his worry about that, but nothing in the way that he was conducive. He did something to bring U-2 down.
Well, right. That was exactly the point. And for the listeners, Ella German, or I have mispronounced it as German before, but Ella German was actually the woman that he had asked to marry previous to Marina, right?
Yeah, exactly. He was really in love with her.
That was a very interesting and telling part in your book, by the way. I really enjoyed reading about that because, again, it gave us another insight into Lee. The idea that he had, maybe done what almost any man that I've known in my lifetime has done at some point or other, taken a drink to sort of, screw together their courage in order to go do something that they're nervous about doing. And he winds up drinking with her, I think, on the New Year's Eve, right?
If you remember the details, I'll skip them. But how to finalize his friendship, from what I learned about all that, what is in my book, and later on, it looks like Ella German was sort of, he wasn't serious about him from the very beginning, and I wouldn't put it past her that he was advised to stick to Lee and to feel how he feels about that. At that time, he had a steady who wants to stay in shadow. I'm not going to tell his name. But she was just, Lee was something that she wasn't really emotionally involved with. But she's a rather good character, you know. When I spoke to her, I carried out a very favorable impression about her, as a sort of, about her integrity and the way her naivety. She said, she was surprised at Lee's reaction when he said he couldn't marry him. She believed he gave him many signs where to stop, where to draw the line in their attitude, you know. And Lee was so infatuated with her that he couldn't get the dream, the sense, you know. But his reaction was interesting, his reaction to all that. He absolutely cut out of his life, as if he didn't exist for him at all. They went on seeing each other at the factory. He wouldn't as much as say hello to her. And Elder German was a little bit, annoyed with all that. He believed, but he didn't realize how deep these emotions were to her. And on the personal side, you know, Ella German was a kind of motherly type of girl. She was older than me. That's an important thing. You know, at that time, a year or two difference plays is very important as far as psychological stability, especially with women and girls is concerned. And she produced an impression of a reliable woman that one could find a sort of awareness to get, sort of respite, refuse from the egos of the outer world. That's the impression she produced with her quiet manner of talk and everything. And possibly that was attractively to him. And besides, she wasn't a pretty girl. That always counts, you know. Somehow we see how we compare, possibly it's somewhere on lower levels, instinctive levels, but somehow we see whether we can do the match together. That's on psychological part. And Lee was so infatuated with her that he didn't read those signs and that possibly ever gave her. But he was really in love with her,
Right, and it seems as though his romantic notion of her was much larger in his own mind, and this is not uncommon for a young man to do. And the fact that he did select her being a little bit older is a rather interesting insight into his psychology at that time. He sought a more stable, more mature sort of female figure, and she seemed to come across that way from what I understand.
Looks like it.
Sorry, go ahead. What?
Yeah, that looks like, yes. Well, just hold a minute. It says battery is very low. I'll switch on the battery. Just hold on.
Sure. So at this point, we got a little bit of an interruption because he's fumbling around with stuff, but I'm not going to cut it at all. We're just going to let it run. You know, I think it's worth noting that his attitude is somewhat askew because, you know, he could only observe what he could observe right there, dealing with him personally.
I'm with you again.
All right. Anyway, here we go. So now,
yeah.
Okay. Another interesting point, which in listening to what you're talking about here, when you mentioned that she was encouraged to be around him, this is another interesting point that I think needs to be made here about the idea of the internal police force
or what is always lumped into the KGB label in the Soviet Union at that time. A lot of the people that were around Oswald in Minsk, to my understanding, were approached by the internal policing agency to sort of watch and report back to them.
And certainly, that was their job, to observe a foreigner, suspicious foreign in their country. They were only doing their job with all means available, yes?
Well, right. This has always been my point, because, you see, some people have stated, and again, I'm not trying to offend you, understand that, but some people have stated.
I got all that already. Long accustomed to being a KGB, a CIA, being converted, being MI6 and everything, triple, and all that sort of thing, which I was not. Yeah?
Yeah, but the thing is that a lot of people say that you have to be suspect because they were all involved with that. And I always state to them that it is essentially as if, to an American, when the FBI comes to you and says to you that there is an outside threat of some type that may be present, and we would just like some information from you, if you're living in that country, it is only sensible that you would offer information or offer your observations to your internal security agency. So that to me is...
You have your point. As far as I am concerned, I believe I was a sort of suspicious character. Why this deviation? I mean, why going on for English? Why that interest? I believe I was rather a person to be observed than to get involved into, looking back. And, Lee, possibly, whoever, they just want to give me enough rope. It wasn't my move to get in touch with Lee. I was introduced to him by a former schoolmate of mine at the Ziggers place. And it was an outside initiative, And I believe my reason behind all that, I was absolutely happy to, at that time there wasn't many people, actually there was only 2 native English speakers in the whole of Minsk. And I was absolutely bored and tired of all those teachers at the Foreign Language Institute with the mannerism, with the Russian accent, how I felt about that, well, being young, And certainly I was happy to learn that there is an American in Minsk, approachable and everything. And I was introduced to him. And my interest was absolutely linguistic. And possibly we were observed together. Oh, yeah, sure. Pavel Gorbachev, who stuck to Lee from the very beginning of the factory, who took a lot of pictures of him. He was his sort of personal photographer. Later on, he turned out to be an informer, KGB informer. What I don't like about him, that he sometimes would provoke people to say things that were dangerous. He would start political-minded conversations, as if, it was very provoking. Certainly, in such a situation, I would just carefully avoid going on into the depth of that. But, my interest behind Lee, linguistic interest, at the time was my research at the students' medical research group. And that was thinking back, I went in for music, for sports, when I was young. Languages, I thought about studying French, German, Italian, but what put me right, I spoke to a polyglot in business at Tartu University. We went there to a student conference there, and I was surprised that he spoke with a Russian accent, in English in any way, and I decided, no, I'm not going to be like him. I rather stick to English language, and that's it, which I did. So I only have scraps of German and French, and English is my main concern. Well, we were young at that time. Well, with so many interests.
Yeah, of course. That's really what I've also postulated about. I postulated this about you before I read your book, actually, that it seemed to me, from what I could understand, talking to a few others, that your interest in Lee really started. You know, it originated with merely the idea that you could have easy access to someone whose native language was English. And
and another thing, about language, to put into the picture, everybody knew me at the English department at the Medical Institute. I would come over to chat with teachers who would swap books, English language books, and they knew my deviation. If I could put it this way. It was sort of devious. Other students would look at me and sometimes would suspect that I am a fraud. And I remember one student said, all right, he produced a dictionary, and there was a group of students formed around us, and he said, all right, and he started asking me to translate words. Well, I did. It was 3,000 words, not a big dictionary. And then he asked me, how did I do that trick? Well, and they exploited me. They would come out before the lectures, lessons in English, and say, English lessons, say, oh, well, please translate that, write it down for me. So everybody knew about that. I had many acquaintances at the Foreign Language Institute. Even I took part in rehearsing My Fair Lady, a student studio there, but it never realized, I never was brought to the audience somehow, it fell apart. So I sort of was known in the city as a student, as medical students goes in for English. Mm-hmm. We all sort of crazy when we were young, this or that way, and that was my way of expressing myself. Yeah. Are you with me?
Okay, go ahead, sorry. Did you have something else you wanted to add there?
Well, that's about my very simple things, about my English. It's very simple. And about Lee, this, you might observe that he was very consistent about his, interest in Russia. He came as a student of the country. He couldn't afford studying, Russia, say, at a university, college, traditional way. And from his point of view, it was only logical, as I say, to come right to the country and learn firsthand things about Russia. And so he did. And again, when he was back home, he was still very interested in Russian politics. He would subscribe to Russian newspapers, periodicals, and he was very interested in that. He did a lecture on communism in Russia. He wrote that essay, Life of a Worker in the Soviet Union, and when I later on read it, I was surprised at his love of details. He knew more than I about the life of people in the Soviet Union. So he was really interested in it. He had no pretense that why go on pretending after he can return back to the country. That was in him, this interest. I want to stress these. His social political views, they explain all things about him. It's the center, pivotal part about his actions. From this point of view, you can understand all his actions. So, well, and in literature, people carefully omit mentioning that. It looks like that situation with out of consent citing our interview about Jack Ma, the killing of people and everything. Let's go on. Out of context citing and snatching only those fragments that you to demonize Oswald, they are being accepted.
Right. Let me just clarify something for my listeners, okay? What happens here is that Dr. Titovets, who was a medical student at the time, with that tape recorder we mentioned much earlier in the interview, they were play acting. And they had done a play acting sort of skit on audio where Dr. Titovets was interviewing a notorious killer of sorts.
I wasn't a doctor at that time. I was a fourth-year student.
Oh, no, I just said you were a medical student at the time. But the thing is that he was interviewing this fictional construct of this guy named Jack Ma, who is supposed to be a killer and all these other things. And he says and he says all of these sort of very hostile, murderous, nearly psychopathic things. And what happened here was that during one of these documentaries, they took that particular piece from Dr. Titovets'
I am aware of that.
recordings. And, well, I'm explaining it to the listeners. Is that they took it out of context and simply used the part where he's saying these sort of psychotic statements, which are completely out of context, and it makes it sound almost as if Oswald has this murderous rage inside of him that he's demonstrating. When meanwhile, it's a play act. It's almost as if you're watching an actor. I have performed Hamlet before. I'm no prince. Okay, so this is what has happened with the misrepresentation of things in the past. And speaking of misrepresentations,
Chuck, excuse me, may I add one more psychological thing about that?
Certainly.
Before those interviews, we read The Killers by Ernest Hemingway. It was modern American stories selected by, selected so that were absolutely those rather sad stories, killings, poor life of poor people there. And he read this through, The Killers there. And possibly after that was that interview. Possibly it was looking at context, psychologically it's only relevant. But why would come with this absolute crazy idea of Lee being a prisoner, in a prison, being this notorious killer Jack Ma. So when you are in the context, and he is a very artistic person, that's another feature of him. He was we read other plays there and tried to imitate his characters, and that was always very telling.
Okay, so just again to clarify, what we're talking about here, again, is that he read this story, drew upon it, as an actor would, as a resource to create a character, which is an artistic aspect of his personality, which is, again, not something that is usually featured in any of these explanations, at least none of the so-called legitimate explanations about the young man's character at that time. And that is a very important point, that this wasn't something that he drew upon because it was part of his persona as a matter of practice. It was simply because it was something that had been accessed by him recently. And it's just a matter of proximity as opposed to a matter of, general focus in his mind. That is a good point. But speaking of these other portraits, okay, and this is again where I felt almost a chill dealing with your representation of Lee as opposed to some of the other, what I consider to be fictional or partially fictional constructs which have come out about it. And I'm not just talking about the official explanation. You are aware of and have at least either read or had some knowledge of the Baker story about him?
Yes, I do.
Do you have any opinion you'd like to offer about that?
From what I didn't read her book, although, well, I have very much my reservations about what she carries on the web and everything. For a professional, what she carries is not exactly true. Well, I'll give you one thing. They were on some secret project of doing in President Fidel Castro in a very cumbersome way. At that time, there were many other more clean, so to speak, ways of killing one person.
Doctor, just 1 second, because I just want to point out something here which I think is of great importance. Yes. The Baker story features, and this is why it is extremely relevant when the doctor will address this. And I have never discussed this with the doctor in the past, so I have no idea what he's about to say. But my point here is that the story has been distributed that Lee Harvey Oswald was involved in a medical research project which was targeted at killing Fidel Castro, okay, who at the time was a sort of considered one of the biggest threats in the world to our country and all this other stuff as far as the media was concerned. All right. And this idea that he was involved in a scientific project which involved various levels of biochemistry, the use of cancer as a weapon, and this type of stuff. This is the type of thing which has been floated in I don't even want to mention the title of the book because I find it a completely useless waste of time. But this story can be found in quite a few places and has been discussed. And it's been circulating. And Dr. Titovets, okay, just as a matter of background, would have a great deal of insight, I believe, into exactly what Lee's capability for this type of action would be, because what type of doctor are you, sir?
In the first place, just to use common sense, it looks like she was, Baker, the mind behind all that. She knew what that project was directed to. And looking objectively, she was nobody in science. The only thing she could do, passing cultures, which is the lowest, thing to do. Anybody can do that after, short training. And if she knew about the final end of the project, and on one hand, and it was believed a high security project, it's nonsense. Those occupying lower levels in the project, they must know nothing about what it's meant for. They do their little things, and this is one contradiction. It's absolutely stupid.
Right. Now, wait just a second. Because here is what has been learned. Just one sec. Because here's what has been learned about this type of operation in the past regarding the United States government and what we have learned about how they handle these projects. What Dr. Titovets is referring to is the common sense that they would compartmentalize any sort of operation on this level. In other words, the individuals who are doing the dirt work are not even going to be aware of where that work is going. They compartmentalize this with the Manhattan Project and any of the biochemical projects that have ever been discovered in any way, shape, or form. This is a proven fact. Not only that, but just from his perspective, he understands full well that this is a matter of common sense as well. You would not allow the lower level couriers and the lower level scientists, which Baker, by her own storyline, would be telling you that she was one of the lower level scientists that could have been involved here. That is that simple. Okay? Yeah. So go on, sir. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to make that point.
Never mind. I met, well, besides that, the very meeting of Lee, she puts in somewhere in the post office, she puts it's in a romantic way. Well, coming back to this project, Lee wasn't the kind of person who would be that stupidly involved into such activity. It wasn't in him at all. Besides, he, felt for Fidel Castro, and I believe possibly Cuba to him was a sort of, place where his theory could be applied to. I'm not sure, but from his general trend of his thinking, it might be the case with him. So he had absolutely not engaged Fidel Castro and not to be involved in such absolutely stupid project. He was very careful not to get involved into even this country, Russia. He stood away from all those viewers it was suggested to, like production for military, special classified research with radioactive things, that's other things. So, there are many things. I saw Baker in Dallas. Honestly, I kept away from her. Something in me told me to stay away from her, and I did. When she realized that I was not going to approach her, she approached me in a rather curious way. It was during my second lecture at another place. Our friends brought me over there, and I was waiting for my turn, and Judy Baker was lurking in the background. I was absorbed in what the lecturer was delivering, and suddenly somebody leaned from behind against my shoulders, and there was a whisper, "Ernst, I'm sorry, when I shook my hand, it wasn't that I disbelieved you." Well, I was shocked. I sprang up. I said, "Well, don't touch me in the first place." And then, I had a course of psychiatry. I said, "We'll talk this over later." Certainly I didn't mean that. She left me. It was absolutely unexpected move from her part, and again, with my psychiatry course, it's something that a person for possession had thought is rather wouldn't go in. Let her enjoy, play with her image of herself as a writer, and so forth and so forth. The curious thing is that he's been given a lot of publicity, and generally I have an idea, I have a feeling that all that literature, books and everything about Lee and JFK where they would go into all details that carry no sense at all, just being choreographed, just to swamp real facts. So now we have what you feel real character of Lee Harvey Oswald, a real man, is nowhere to be found. And I don't think that my book would put things right, but I had to get it out of my system. I had to give my side of the story. And
well,
actually,
right.
Yeah.
Right, but I'm sorry, but the thing is this. Let me see if you agree with what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
The portrait of Oswald has been distorted in some ways in a favorable way, sometimes in other ways in a negative way. And the key here is not that Dr. Titovets' book answers all questions or provides a full portrait of the man entirely. But what is clear is that it is an honest portrayal from a first-hand perspective of someone who actually spent time with him. That is for certain. But he by no means tries to answer all the questions or to claim that it is an absolutely a complete portrait of the man entirely. Am I right?
Well, yes. In any way, I think I gave how I felt about Lee. And as far as first-hand facts are concerned, I wasn't influenced by anything. When I wrote that, I only was guided by my feelings and my experience as a researcher. I am a professional researcher in the area of basic neurology, and I try to be, not to be biased. And what I wrote in my book, it's my account and my representation of Lee Harvey Oswald as I knew him. Certainly nobody is perfect, but it's not a reason to just not to take into account at least those things that's first-hand, where first-hand facts are being put before an audience, And actually, I put all that behind already. I don't believe in the justice would be prevail in our lifetime. I'm now going for my research. I'm really observed in that. And to me, be the kind of, reminiscences of my young age. It was great at that time. Well, possibly that's how all people think about things. But not telling that in a sort of rosy way, no. I'm quite realistic about that time, but that was the man I knew, and absolutely honest about that. And there's one thing I want to cite. In my book, I answer this question: was Lee a happy man? And I write here, was he a happy man? If happy means being able to make a free choice of one's mission in life and to work towards achieving that goal, then he was a happy man. His was the idealistic mission of trying to make his country a better place. It's surprising how daring and determined he had been, guided by his ideal. In his Athenian system, he believed he had found a third way beyond the pitfalls of both communism and capitalism. It was an answer he arrived at both from direct experience and through diligent theoretical research. His was a life filled with adventure and endeavor, all of which was directed towards that idealistic goal. He saw the world, met interesting people, and drew his own fearless conclusions about the possibility of imaging a world beyond the physical, intellectual, political, and even personal confines of the Cold War. He was a happy man. I'm with you. Charles?
Yeah, yes. I was listening to you. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
No, I really appreciate that, because that is again, just a really honest statement. I mean, this very young man took it upon himself to study from a first-hand perspective what it would be like to live in the Soviet Union, examined the system around him as he saw it. He recognized other injustices I've read in his writings about his views about race and all of these different things that were occurring in the context of the time, and he was very thoughtful about this and had an opinion which went outside of the sort of choices that were given to the public at the time to choose a side in a way. All those behind the Iron Curtain and all those involved in that system, they're supposed to be your enemy. They are not, they're not, even President Kennedy was speaking at that point in time to the idea of, we all share this planet and all of this. This was a very sort of humanistic approach, as opposed to being confined to your own native system or to admiring a foreign system. He actually thought this through.
Yeah, and there's sort of hypocrisy to U.S.S.R. Oswald, who cared about his country and loved President Kennedy, as a scapegoat, as to stage him to, as an assassin. There was sort of hypocrisy about all that, unscrupulous hypocrisy.
Unscrupulous hypocrisy.
Are you sleepy or what?
No, I was
just the point at which I was having trouble with my
trouble. I muted out so that I wouldn't make any noise while you were speaking there, and I had trouble clicking it back on.
Yeah, at least make some noises.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, still in touch.
We're only going to go about 20 more minutes here. All right. And, if that's okay with you?
Oh, it's quite okay with me.
All right. Great. Is there...
I wound up going further. But...
Now, this is always hard to do because, it's very interesting to me that, that you've taken the time to, evaluate this both from a personal perspective and as a researcher, which gives it a great deal of context, and to again, put it into context, exactly. Would you like to just talk about how it was that you came to actually meet him, the circumstances and things like that? I mean, would you mind doing that?
Skype.
Pardon? You mean how I came to writing my book and what?
No, that when you came to meet Lee,
yes.
Exactly how that occurred.
All right. As I said, it was somewhere in 1960, January, at a skating rink. That school girl, mate of mine, he approached me and said, Eric, would you like to meet an American? And, I wouldn't put it past her that she was just pulling my hand and my leg, There were a lot of jokes about me with my, ambition to study, with my English. Well, I said, yes, I would. And she started on that he was young, that he worked at the radio factory, and everything. Well, all that girlish stuff. And she said, I might arrange the meeting, the two of you, and that was the end of it. And only somewhere in autumn and September, when I clean forgot about that, I thought that American might already be back home, that she said, well, you're invited to the Zigger's place. And the Zigger worked, 110 people, family, Spanish-speaking family. Actually, they were Jews. And he worked at the radio plant with Oswald. And I was appointed the meeting with, I had to come with the Zigger's family at their place at a certain time, which I came. There was, I liked that place. It was fully lighted. There was Anita Zigger, girl, student of music, full of pranks. I was Mary, and there was her mother, and Signora Anna, and sister Eleonora Zigger, a singer, professional singer, mezzo, a wonderful voice. And Anita ushered me into a room, and there I met a young man. First I knew him to be a little bit older, a couple of years older than myself, standing by a piano, left way, he was quietly at me. Well, shook hands, and Anita left us, and we talked. From the very beginning, it looked like Lee was ready to, for me, he was a ready listener, and I had to keep it rolling, And the very first impression was a quiet man, I sort of psychologically compatible, and I was, sort of tongue-tied, I had this linguistic inferiority complex at that time while speaking to a foreigner. My language was rather artificial, academic at that time, and not much idiomatic expressions, and possibly that put it on certain formal level. And I knew nothing about his background. Had it been the local guy, I would immediately knew, having learned which form or which institute he studied at, I would immediately formed an idea about him, about his education, background, everything. And here it was absolutely unknown quantity to me. That was fascinating. From his accent, at that time I could differentiate between Northern American Arctic English and Southern American English. It was non-Arctic, a sort of Southern drawl, he would say not at all, something like that, sort of nasal twang. At that time I couldn't differentiate whether it was nasal twang or sort of congested nose, something like that. And his habit of inclining his head towards the listener on one side. At that time, I could not relate it to some hearing problems, as it turned out to be later on. Well, otherwise, it was quite all right. I remember watching carefully his lips, articulation, matching all that against what the pictures presented in textbook on English phonetics. And, so I was sort of happy to meet the native English speaker. And then Anita burst into the room, and there was a whirl of activity. Lee was a sort of be a member of the family. He was liked by everybody. Everybody would need his advice and everything. And we had lunch. Signora Anna asked me many questions if I was married, if where we lived, we had owned a car. So Lee had opportunity to learn a lot about me, although I knew nothing about him. And at the end, he suggested, we have played different plays there, like Spin a Bottle. I stayed away from that. Lee liked that. Then on the way, I learned that he got a good pitch. I need to arrange a sort of examination who would guess which key was pressed on the piano. Well, for me it was easy. The same for Lee. Well, that sort of things. And in the end, Lee suggested that we went together. By that time, he knew where I lived. And we went together. And already near his place, he pointed me to windows on the 4th floor. Said he lived there. And there I did a mistake, also telling mistake. I just thought about polite phrase to conclude our meeting, and polite phrase wasn't easy to formalize in my head. And suddenly I bled out, "I shall expose you." Well, I thought about, sorry for exploiting you all the time, my petty questions, that sort of things, and it realized into this, "I shall expose you." That's absolutely stupid, of course. I didn't know exactly what that word meant, And Lee's reaction was absolutely amazing, as if he had received a powerful uppercut on his jaw. He sort of, almost as if he was sprung there. And another interesting thing, possibly looking at me, he realized I was absolutely, I realized that I did something absolutely what I shouldn't have done, and I was ready to kiss goodbye to my friendship with him and everything, on my vision of learning things about foreign country firsthand and everything. But suddenly he abruptly changed. By the way, it's part of his character. He realized the innocence of my meaning, looking at my face, and he quieted down. He saw me to a bus stop and invited me to come over his place. And next, he bought tickets for me, and we went together to watch The Queen of Spades. That's also, again, a telling feature about Lee's character. He was quick to grasp situation, and it was good to read human mind. Yes, I'm with me.
That's excellent. Yeah, I find that really fascinating, because the telling sort of side of him that was able to analyze and sort of shift his demeanor has been prominent throughout any of the conversations I've had about him.
Excuse me. And again, this very interesting thing. I gave him a best chance to tell him to piss off, but I believe he saw something in me. It's looking back. The curious thing, when I wrote that book, I just would see myself as a student, friend of Lee Harvey Oswald at that time, and again as a Professor Ernst Titovets, just viewing my actions, my life at that time with new experience, sort of schizophrenia in a positive way. And that's sort of, this is the same person doing things differently. And really, it must be something that Lee thought important to keep in touch with me. I don't know what. But again, this come again, that I gained best opportunity to go and jump, After that, he might say, okay, go and do your whatever you want to expose somewhere else. But he was quick to grasp the the innocence of my intention, and didn't play it against me, you know. And again, coming back to those letters, after he left to the United States, he wrote more letters to me than I did to him. I was rather lazy. Again, it was important for him to communicate with me. Possibly he could discuss things with me in his mother tongue. I don't know. And anyway, it was sort of psychological compatibility, and possibly in that country, being alone, it was sort of important for him to keep in touch at least with a person whom he sort of liked well, and well, that's it.
Right, and I do find that extremely fascinating, because he did maintain a contact with you, as you said, all the way up to October, and it's really amazing. This is why when I've sort of described you in the past, I've borrowed a phrase that I saw somewhere else. They called you his best friend in Russia.
Well, looking back, it looks like, yeah.
It seems as though that would be a fair assessment. And the nice thing here is, again, that we have an honest sort of portrait. And, being that I'm not all up on the stuff that's available right now, I'd like to make sure that we cover for my listeners where it is. You said it's available on Amazon, your book?
Yeah, Amazon Kindle, yes, it's available.
Okay. On top of that, there was a website. Is that still in operation?
Well, yes, my website is still in operation. It's www.etitovets.com. And there are some tape recordings also there, so it might be interesting.
Right, there's the part of the session that we talked about earlier with the Jack Maar part, a little bit of narration by Dr. Titovets. There's also some excerpts from the book last time I was there. And I'm telling you, if you want to understand the character that has been rather unfairly portrayed in various venues, I can't recommend that people look at this any more than I do. This is one of the essential books if you want to understand a little bit about how hard is it to understand a man's insides? It's very difficult. But the point here is that this is an insight from a honest, in first person look from someone who was a friend of his, someone who interacted with him, someone who had a real bird's eye view of this man's character, his reactions, his ability to deal with things, his ability to analyze things, his linguistic abilities. This is not just guesswork by somebody like me looking back at documents. So we're back to the live. The deal is that this interview continues a little longer than my show would have allowed anyway. So there's a lot more to it. There's a whole incident where he describes basically Lee saving his life at one point. There's a whole lot of stuff on here. All right. But unfortunately, I'm just about out of time for my show tonight. And we'll see what else we can dig up as we go. I tried to interact with the chat room a little bit, and it wound up sort of, I had a few people that were interested in what I was doing here tonight, but I'm not sure about what the majority of the people in the room thought. I'm not sure about what the majority of the people that I know were listening tonight thought, but I got to tell you, I think that this was definitely a valuable use of the time that I'm allowed, and I'm always happy to say that I'm grateful to Jules, and I'm grateful to the network, and I'm grateful to everybody for listening, whether you liked it or not. Go ahead and do with it what you will. The bottom line is you're listening to the Ochelli Effect on UCY.TV radio, and I'm telling you,
if you had any interest in the assassination, if you have a desire to understand the actual people that participated, we can't talk to Lee because he's dead. We can't talk to most of the people that I guarantee you had the key information nowadays. Over the years, I've had to sit and reconstruct things with various individuals. I mean, I'm talking about dozens of Dallas police officers. I'm talking about, well, probably about a dozen doctors. I'm talking about, these different players that were involved with the KGB and everything else. Stay tuned for after last night. Have a good one. At the age of 19 in 1962, she was
See, but I have the files. I read this stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things. I said to myself, how can that be possible? The brain, pistols and fondle slab of choice. I don't know when that was. Internet, professional wrestlers, and not just Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the information comes from as long as it's real. It's hard to get real information because seriously, they don't